Hello and welcome to another Business Tube podcast, and today's session we are going to be looking at the public and private sectors, and we're also going to be looking at privatisation and nationalisation. Now, first of all, you need to be aware of the difference between the public sector and the private sector. Okay, now the public sector, like it says on here guys, these are businesses owned and controlled by the government. So the public sector, all of the businesses that are owned and controlled by the government. So they include schools, hospitals, the army, okay, the health service, they include the police stations. Okay, so these are all the businesses that are owned and controlled by the government. They're owned and controlled by the government because they're there to provide a service to everybody. Every single person has the right to police protection, to use the fire service, to use the hospitals. So these are the businesses that are owned and controlled by the government, and the government owns these businesses to provide a service to the people of the country like you and I. They also include, and they may use this word in the exam, public corporations. Okay, public corporations are businesses owned by the government. Okay, again, be thinking about things like schools, hospitals. They can be called public corporations. Also, things like the BBC. These are owned by the government as well. Okay, please do not confuse public corporations with public limited companies. Okay, public limited companies is something we're going to look at further in the course. If you haven't looked at that already, please do not confuse public corporations. Public corporations are owned and controlled by the government, so then in the public sector. The private sector, these are all the businesses that are owned by entrepreneurs, by private individuals, and they usually exist to make a profit. So if a business is owned and controlled by an entrepreneur, then that is in the private sector. Other types of businesses that are in the private sector, sort of all the ones from the business ownership sessions that we've looked at. So we've got sole traders, partnerships, public limited companies, private limited companies, and franchisers are all in the private sector. Please don't get caught out, because this is a very, very common mistake to make. Please do not get caught out by public limited companies. Public limited companies are in the private sector. Okay? The reason why they have public in the name is because anybody can buy shares. So the shares are sold to the public. Okay? So public limited companies are in the private sector. That's a very, very easy mistake to make. Do not fall for that one. Okay? Okay, the reasons why businesses are under control by the government then, to ensure that everybody has access to these services. We all need access to healthcare, we all need access to the police service, to the fire brigade. Okay, so these are public services owned and controlled by the government. We don't want a situation where some people can afford to pay for the fire service and some people can't. So if somebody's paid for the fire service, they can have their house put out if it's on fire, but somebody who hasn't, well, we'll just leave their house to burn and we won't care about them. We can't have this situation. These services are services that everybody needs, whether you're rich or poor. Okay? So these services are provided by the government for all of society, such as the healthcare, the schools, hospitals, police, fire brigade. These are all provided by the government. Okay, you do need to know what mixed economies are. Mixed economies, quite simply guys, are economies that have both the private and the public sector. So Qatar, the UK, okay, all of these countries are mixed economies. All the Western countries are mixed economies, where we have some businesses in the public sector, such as schools and hospitals, and some businesses in the private sector, such as supermarkets, banks, and these kind of businesses, Toyota, etc., in the private sector. So this is a graph that shows the mixture. Around about, this would be what, 20% of the businesses are in the public sector, owned and controlled by the government. The rest are in the private sector, owned by private individuals, usually to make a profit. Okay, you need to know about the difference between nationalisation and privatisation. Now, nationalisation is the first one. Nationalisation is when a business is taken from the private sector and it's taken back into the public sector. So the government sees, they take back control, or they buy back a business that is in the private sector and they bring it back into the public sector. In the UK, a very pertinent example of this has been in the news at the minute is that the railways in the UK are currently, as it stands at the moment, in the private sector, but there's talk in the government that they may take control and bring the railways and bring them back into the public sector. So take control of the railways again, take them from the private sector to the public sector. That is nationalisation. The opposite of that is privatisation. Now, privatisation is when a business is sold from the public sector to the private sector. So the government release this business, they sell this business, it's no longer owned by the government, and now it is privatisation, and it goes to the private sector. Examples of businesses that used to be owned by the government in the UK, the British Petroleum, the oil fields, so all the oil reserves, all the oil businesses used to be owned by the government, but they sold that and privatised it. Okay? The postal system used to be owned by the government. The government used to run, own, control the postal system, but they decided to privatise it. They sold it from the public sector to the private sector, so it was privatised, and that is privatisation. Now, you do need to be aware of the reasons for and against privatisation and nationalisation. If you haven't watched the videos that are also on Frog, guys, please make sure you watch those as well. There are some useful video clips on Frog to go with this podcast. But the arguments for privatisation, well, the government are trying to run everything. They're trying to run the army, the hospitals, the police, the fire stations, the postal service, the oil fields. And the problem is that the government doesn't run things very efficiently. Now, the reason the government doesn't run things very efficiently is because they don't exist to make a profit. The government's not there to make a profit. The government is just there to provide services. Well, unfortunately, when you're there to provide services, you're not very efficient. If you want to become efficient, you need to be privatised. You need to be in the private sector where you exist to make a profit. Because in the private sector, if you're not very efficient, you'll die. You'll go bankrupt. Okay, so businesses in the private sector are much, much more efficient because they exist to make money, make a profit. Whereas the government, they don't care about profit, they can waste money, it doesn't really matter, they're just taking money from taxes, so they're very inefficient in the public sector. So privatisation, sell those assets, release those assets into the private sector, they'll be much more efficient because they need to make a profit. What does that mean? Well, in the private sector, they'll reduce waste, so there'll be less waste. Okay, in order to make a profit, the cost will go down in order to make a profit. So I've got on here, guys, profit-generating businesses, like I just said, are more efficient. Nationalised industries were inefficient. Remember, if something's nationalised, it's owned by the government, so it's in the public sector. And private sector businesses would reduce costs and waste in order to make a profit. So private sector businesses tend to be much less wasteful, much more efficient in order to make a profit. The arguments against privatisation. So the example, guys, remember the example that I gave in class? Privatisation is all about profit. They don't care about the quality of service. It's not about providing the top quality of service. It's about making money, making a profit. So where I used to live in the UK, I used to live out in the hills, in the middle of nowhere, very, very far from anywhere. The bus service, there was nobody on the bus, but the bus still used to come, and I used to get on it when I was a little bit older than you guys doing my A-levels. So the bus service used to come to my village when the government owned it. Why? Because what does the government care about? Providing a service, providing a top quality good service to the people. But the bus service was privatised, so it went from the public sector to the private sector. Now what does the private sector care about? Profit. And they looked at my bus route that came to my home, and they decided they weren't making enough money. So they cut the service. They got rid of the service. There's no more buses coming to my village in England, okay? Because they weren't making a profit out of that particular service. So privatised businesses, they may reduce the service quality may go down, because all they care about, all they're focusing about is making a profit. The healthcare, they might stop providing drugs for certain cancer treatments, for example, because they're too expensive. They don't care about the service that they're providing to you, they just care about making money. If they can't make money out of you, they won't provide that service. So there is a very, very strong argument against privatisation. Okay, so like I've got here, guys, there are safety concerns as well with privatisation. Again, because private sector businesses might cut corners, they're all about making money. They might not do as many safety checks because safety checks are expensive, and that can cause safety problems. And unprofitable parts of the business, like I've just said, will be closed down once they're in the private sector. If it's not making money, they'll get rid of it. Okay, so there's very, very big reasons why a lot of people are against privatisation. Okay, that's it for today's podcast, guys. I hope you found that useful, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.